Margaret Sullivan thought she knew all the traps of power until the moment her daughter announced her engagement. The diamond ring sparkled on the mahogany table as Emma beamed, but Margaret felt the world crumble beneath her feet. The problem wasn't the groom's age or his financial situation. The problem was that Margaret couldn't stop thinking about the man her own daughter was about to marry. Margaret Sullivan's hands trembled as she stared at her daughter's engagement ring, sparkling under the morning light. The 2-carat diamond caught the sunbeams streaming through her penthouse office windows, throwing tiny rainbows across the mahogany desk where she'd built her empire. "Mum, you're scaring me," Emma whispered, her 18-year-old voice barely audible above the city traffic 40 floors below. "Say something, please." The silence stretched like a taut wire between them. Margaret's throat felt dry, her carefully constructed world suddenly tilting on its axis. She'd survived her husband's death 5 years ago, built a fortune from nothing, raised Emma alone with iron determination. But this moment, this simple announcement threatened to unravel everything she thought she understood about control. "He's 25, Margaret finally managed, her voice catching on the words. The age gap wasn't the issue. The real problem sat deeper, in a place she'd locked away so tightly she'd almost forgotten it existed. The problem was how her heart had started racing the moment Emma mentioned his name. Daniel Martinez, the young architect with gentle eyes and calloused hands who'd been renovating her properties for the past 3 months. The man who made her coffee taste better in the morning, who looked at blueprints like they were poetry, who somehow made her remember what it felt like to be seen as more than just a business machine. "Mom!" Emma's voice grew smaller, more uncertain. She twisted the ring around her finger, a nervous habit that reminded Margaret so painfully of her own younger self. "I thought you liked Daniel. You two work together all the time now. You said he was talented, that he had vision." Margaret's chest tightened. Yes, she'd said those things. She'd said them while watching the way his shoulders moved when he leaned over architectural drawings. She'd said them while breathing in the scent of his cologne mixed with sawdust and ambition. She'd said them while fighting against thoughts that no mother should ever have about her daughter's boyfriend. "I do like Daniel," Margaret said carefully, each word measured like ingredients in a dangerous recipe. "He's a good man, honest, hard-working." The lies felt smooth on her tongue because they weren't lies at all. They were simply incomplete truths. She did think he was good and honest and hard-working. She just hadn't mentioned that she also thought about his laugh at inappropriate moments during board meetings, or how his presence made her feel less alone in her glass tower. Emma's face brightened, relief washing over her features like sunrise after a storm. "Oh, thank God. I was terrified you'd think I was too young or that he wasn't successful enough, or—" "Success isn't everything," Margaret interrupted, the words surprising even herself. When had she started believing that? Probably around the time Daniel had shown her sketches of low-income housing projects he wanted to build, his eyes lighting up as he talked about sustainable materials and community gardens. Sometimes the most valuable things can't be measured in dollars. The irony wasn't lost on her. Margaret Sullivan, the woman who'd clawed her way to the top of the real estate empire, preaching about things that couldn't be bought. But sitting there, watching her daughter's joy, she felt the weight of every sacrifice she'd made, every missed school play, every rushed dinner, every relationship she'd avoided because business was safer than vulnerability. "He wants to meet with you officially," Emma said, practically bouncing in her chair. "You know, ask for permission properly. He's old-fashioned like that. Says it's about respecting family traditions." Margaret's pulse quickened. Another meeting, another opportunity to sit across from Daniel, pretending to evaluate his worthiness. For her daughter, while her traitorous heart counted the minutes until she could hear his voice again. "So of course, that's appropriate. Can we do it tonight at dinner? I know it's short notice, but he's been so nervous about it, and I told him you'd understand. Tonight is fine." The words escaped before Margaret could stop them. She had 3 conference calls scheduled, a property acquisition to review, and a dozen contracts waiting for her signature. But the thought of seeing Daniel again, of having a legitimate excuse to be in the same room with him, made every rational business decision crumble like sand. Emma jumped up and hugged her, the familiar scent of her shampoo mixing with the lingering aroma of Margaret's morning coffee. "You're the best mum ever." "I know this is right, Mom. I can feel it in my bones. Daniel makes me feel safe and loved and like I can be myself without apologies." Safe and loved and authentic. 3. Things Margaret hadn't felt in years, not until Daniel Martinez walked into her life with his rolled-up sleeves and his genuine smile. The guilt hit her like a physical blow, settling in her stomach like lead. What kind of mother felt jealous of her own daughter's happiness? After Emma left, Margaret stood at her office windows looking down at the city she'd conquered. The buildings below looked like a miniature world from this height, all sharp angles and calculated spaces, so different from the organic, flowing designs Daniel created. His sketches had curves and gardens, places where people could gather and breathe and belong. Her assistant knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through 15 years of loyalty. "Mrs. Sullivan, your 2 o'clock is here, the Henderson acquisition." Margaret nodded absently, her reflection staring back from the window glass. At 52, she still turned heads. Regular yoga kept her body strong, expensive treatments kept her skin smooth, and power kept her shoulders straight. But looking at herself now, she saw something different. A hunger she'd been ignoring, a loneliness she'd been denying. The Henderson meeting dragged on for 2 hours. Margaret signed papers and approved budgets while her mind wandered to tonight's dinner. What would she wear? Something maternal and appropriate, or something that might make Daniel's eyes linger just a moment longer than they should? The thought disgusted and thrilled her in equal measure. By 5 o'clock, she was home in her sprawling suburban estate, a monument to success she'd built more for intimidation than comfort. The house felt empty most days, its 10 bedrooms and 7 bathrooms echoing with the ghosts of the family life she'd never quite managed to create. Tonight, though, it would be filled with voices and laughter and the dangerous electricity of Daniel's presence. She changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple black dress that could pass for professional but clung in all the right places. Her hands shook as she applied lipstick, catching her own eyes in the bathroom mirror. "You're pathetic," she whispered to her reflection. A pathetic middle-aged woman developing a crush on her daughter's fiancé. But even as she said the words, she couldn't stop the flutter of anticipation in her chest. The doorbell rang at 7 sharp. Margaret opened it to find Daniel holding a bouquet of wildflowers, his dark hair slightly mussed from the autumn wind. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, nothing expensive or flashy, but he looked more real than any man in her orbit of suited executives and business partners. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, offering the flowers with a smile that made her forget to breathe for a moment. "Thank you for having me tonight. I know how busy you are." "Please call me Margaret," she said, accepting the bouquet. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and she felt an electric jolt that had nothing to do with static electricity. "These are beautiful, very thoughtful." Emma appeared behind her, sliding an arm around Daniel's waist with the easy intimacy of young love. "Aren't they perfect together?" she said. And for a heart-stopping moment, Margaret thought she meant something else entirely. "Wildflowers are so much better than those fancy roses you usually get, Mom." Dinner was torture disguised as celebration. Margaret sat across from the couple, watching Emma feed Daniel bites of dessert, listening to their inside jokes and shared dreams. Every laugh they shared felt like a knife twist in her chest. Every time Daniel's hand covered Emma's on the table, Margaret had to resist the urge to look away. But worse than the jealousy was the way Daniel kept including her in the conversation, asking her opinion about their plans, treating her with a respect and genuine interest that none of Emma's previous boyfriends had shown. He asked about her business philosophy, her thoughts on sustainable development, her memories of Emma's childhood. He listened to her answers like they mattered, like she was more than just an obstacle to overcome. "I have something important to discuss," Daniel said as they moved to the living room for coffee. The evening light slanted through the tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the Persian rug. Emma curled up beside him on the sofa, while Margaret chose the safety of the armchair across from them. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was it, the formal request for her daughter's hand, the moment when she would have to smile and give her blessing while her world crumbled around her. "I know I don't have much to offer Emma financially," Daniel began, his voice steady, but his hands betraying his nervousness as they fidgeted with his coffee cup. "I'm just starting my architecture firm, and I'll probably struggle for the first few years. But I love your daughter more than I've ever loved anything in my life." Emma's eyes filled with tears, the happy kind that made her look even more beautiful. Margaret felt her own throat close up, but for entirely different reasons. "I promise to work every day to deserve her love," Daniel continued, "to build a life worthy of the incredible woman she is, to honor the values you've taught her and the strength you've shown as her mother." Margaret's carefully constructed composure began to crack, the sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at Emma like she was made of starlight and miracles, the genuine respect he showed for Margaret herself. It was everything any mother should want for her daughter. It was also everything Margaret wanted for herself. "I don't need your money," Emma said softly, taking Daniel's hand. "I need your heart, and I already have that." "You do," Daniel confirmed, bringing her knuckles to his lips for a gentle kiss. "Forever and always." Margaret watched this exchange, memorizing every detail despite the pain it caused. The way Daniel's thumb traced circles on Emma's palm, the way Emma's face glowed with certainty and joy, the way they seemed to exist in a bubble of perfect understanding, complete without anyone else. "Mrs. Sullivan," Daniel's voice brought her back to the moment. "Margaret, do we have your blessing?" 3 pairs of eyes focused on her. Emma's bright with hope, Daniel's dark with nervous anticipation, and her own, reflected in the window behind them, haunted with secrets she could never speak. She opened her mouth to give the expected response, the motherly blessing that would make everyone smile and move forward with wedding plans. Instead, what came out was, "I need some time to think about it." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's face fell, confusion replacing joy. Daniel's expression shifted to concern, then something that might have been understanding. In that moment, Margaret realized with crystal clarity that he knew. Somehow, impossibly, Daniel Martinez knew exactly what she was feeling. And judging by the way his eyes held hers for just a heartbeat too long before he looked away, the knowledge didn't disgust him the way it should have. The phone rang at 6:30 the next morning, jolting Margaret from the restless sleep that had finally claimed her around 4. Emma's voice crackled through the speaker, thick with tears and confusion. "Mum, what happened last night? Daniel barely said 2 words on the drive home. Did I do something wrong? Did he?" Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her reflection in the dresser mirror across the room. Her hair was disheveled, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion, and her silk nightgown wrinkled from hours of tossing and turning. She looked like a woman coming apart at the seams, which was exactly what she was. "Nothing happened, sweetheart," she lied, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "I was just caught off guard. It's a big decision, and I want to make sure you're both ready for such a commitment." "But you've known Daniel for months now. You said yourself he was a good man." "What? Changed?" "Everything, nothing." The answer was both and neither, a paradox that Margaret couldn't explain without destroying her daughter's world. "I just need to be thorough. You know how I am about important decisions." Emma's sniffle came through clearly. "He thinks you don't approve of him. He's convinced it's because he doesn't have money or connections or—" "That's not it," Margaret interrupted, perhaps too quickly. "Money has nothing to do with this." "Then what does?" The question hung in the air like smoke, choking and inescapable. Margaret closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples where a headache was already building. "I'll talk to him today. We have the Riverside property inspection scheduled anyway. I'll explain things." What she would explain, she had no idea. How could she tell Daniel that her hesitation had nothing to do with his worthiness and everything to do with the way her pulse quickened when he walked into a room? How could she admit that she lay awake at night thinking about his hands, his laugh, the way he looked at architectural drawings like they held the secrets of the universe? After Emma hung up, Margaret stood in her marble shower for 30 minutes, letting the hot water scald away the shame that clung to her skin like oil. But no amount of expensive soap could cleanse the guilt that had settled into her bones. She was 52 years old, successful beyond her wildest dreams, and she was acting like a teenager with her first crush. The Riverside property was a converted warehouse Daniel was transforming into affordable housing units. Margaret had bought it specifically because she knew he needed the work, though she'd convinced herself it was a sound investment. Now walking through the construction zone in her tailored suit and safety helmet, she realized how transparent her motives had been. Daniel was waiting for her near the main entrance, his tool belt slung low on his hips and sawdust in his dark hair. He looked up from his clipboard when she approached, and the careful distance in his eyes made her stomach clench with regret. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said formally, the warmth she'd grown accustomed to completely absent. "I've prepared a full progress report for your review." "Daniel," she began, but he was already walking toward the first unit, his shoulders rigid with tension. The tour was professional and thorough. Daniel showed her the energy-efficient windows, the sustainable flooring materials, the community garden space he'd designed for the central courtyard. His passion for the project was evident in every detail, from the wheelchair-accessible units to the natural lighting he'd incorporated throughout the building. But there was something else in his voice today, a strain that hadn't been there before. He kept his distance, never allowing their hands to touch when he passed her documents, never meeting her eyes for more than a moment at a time. "The timeline is on schedule," he said, as they stood in what would become the community room. "Assuming no weather delays, we should have families moving in by spring." Margaret nodded, pretending to study the blueprints he'd spread across a makeshift table. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and uncomfortable truths. Finally, she couldn't stand it anymore. "About last night," she began. "You don't need to explain." His voice was quiet but firm. "I understand your concerns about Emma marrying someone without financial security. I should have expected that from someone in your position." "That's not why I hesitated." Daniel's hands stilled on the blueprints. Slowly he looked up at her, and Margaret saw something flicker in his dark eyes. Recognition, fear, understanding. Then why? The question was simple. The answer was impossible. Margaret opened her mouth, then closed it again, trapped between honesty and self-preservation. Around them, the construction sounds echoed off concrete walls, hammering, drilling, the distant sound of workers calling to each other. Normal sounds of normal people doing normal work, while she stood there drowning in abnormal feelings. For her daughter's fiancé. "I don't want Emma to get hurt," she said finally, which was true even if it wasn't the complete truth. "I would never hurt her." Daniel's voice was steady, but Margaret caught the slight tremor underneath. "She's the most important thing in my life." Should be, Margaret thought. She should be the most important thing. But standing here in this empty room with him, watching the way the afternoon light streaming through the windows highlighted the strong line of his jaw, Margaret wondered if that was entirely true anymore. "I know you wouldn't hurt her intentionally," Margaret said carefully. "But sometimes people change. Sometimes they discover that what they thought they wanted isn't what they actually need." Daniel's eyes sharpened, and Margaret realized too late how her words might be interpreted. She wasn't talking about him and Emma. She was talking about herself. "Are we still discussing my relationship with your daughter?" he asked quietly. The question hung between them like a bridge neither of them dared to cross. Margaret's heart pounded so loud she was sure he could hear it over the construction noise. This was the moment she could step back from the edge and return to being nothing more than Emma's protective mother, or the moment she could acknowledge the truth that had been growing between them for months. Before she could answer, Daniel's phone rang. Emma's ringtone, a song Margaret recognized because her daughter had played it constantly for weeks after they started dating. Daniel glanced at the screen, and the spell was broken. "I should take this," he said, stepping away from her. "Hi, beautiful, how's your day going?" Margaret watched him transform as he talked to Emma. His shoulders relaxed, a genuine smile replaced the tension in his face, and his voice became warm and tender. This was how a man in love should sound. This was how Daniel sounded when he talked to her daughter. So why did Margaret feel like she was watching a performance? The call lasted 10 minutes, filled with Emma's excited chatter about wedding venues and Daniel's patient responses. Margaret pretended to review the construction progress while secretly listening to every word, every inflection, every pause in their conversation. "I love you too," Daniel said before hanging up, but to Margaret's trained ear, it sounded more like a promise than a declaration. "She's looking at the Whitmore estate for the reception," Daniel said when he returned to her side. "She wants to know if you think it's too extravagant." "Nothing is too extravagant for Emma's wedding," Margaret replied automatically, though the words felt like glass in her throat. "I want her to have everything she dreams of, even if those dreams include marrying someone like me." The vulnerability in his question caught her off guard. Daniel Martinez, who commanded construction crews and designed buildings with confidence, looked suddenly young and uncertain. Margaret's protective instincts warred with her inappropriate feelings, creating a chaos in her chest that made breathing difficult. "Emma could do worse," she said, aiming for maternal reassurance and landing somewhere closer to personal confession. Daniel studied her face for a long moment. Could she do better? The honest answer was yes. Emma could marry someone her own age, someone without the complications that seemed to follow Daniel like shadows. Someone who didn't make Margaret's pulse race and her moral compass spin like a broken toy. But looking at Daniel now, seeing the genuine concern in his eyes and the calluses on his hands from honest work, Margaret realized that better was a relative term. Better financially? Probably. Better socially? Possibly. Better for Emma's heart. She wasn't sure anyone could love her daughter more completely than Daniel did. The problem was that Margaret was beginning to suspect she could love Daniel just as completely. "She could marry someone who doesn't challenge me so much," Margaret said, instead the admission slipping out before she could stop it. "Challenge you how?" Margaret turned away, pretending to examine the window installation, but she could feel Daniel's presence behind her, warm and solid and dangerously appealing. "You make me question things I thought I knew about myself." The admission hung in the air between them, dangerous and loaded with meaning. Margaret waited for Daniel to laugh it off, to make some joke about difficult mothers-in-law or demanding clients. Instead, he moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne mixed with sawdust and afternoon sweat. "What kinds of things?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Margaret closed her eyes, fighting against the urge to turn around and face him. If she turned around now, if she looked into his eyes, she might do something they would both regret forever. "Things I shouldn't be questioning." "Margaret!" Her name on his lips was like a prayer and a curse combined. "Look at me!" She turned, despite every rational thought screaming at her to run. Daniel was standing closer than propriety allowed, his dark eyes intense with an emotion she recognized because she felt it too. Want, need, the terrible, beautiful certainty that they were balanced on the edge of something that would destroy everything they both claimed to value. "This can't happen," she whispered. "I know. Emma loves you. I know. I love Emma. I know that too." "Then why?" "Because sometimes life doesn't give you what you want when you want it." Daniel's hand moved as if to touch her face, then dropped to his side. "Sometimes it gives you what you need when it's the worst possible timing." Margaret's breath caught in her throat. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if I had met you first," he trailed off, shaking his head, "but I didn't. I met Emma first, and I care about her too much to hurt her. Then we pretend this conversation never happened." "Can you do that?" Margaret thought. About going home to her empty house, sitting through family dinners while watching Daniel and Emma plan their future together, smiling and nodding while her heart slowly broke into pieces. "I have to." "So do I." They stood there for another moment, memorizing each other's faces like soldiers before a battle. Then Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "How's the inspection going? Is Daniel showing you his favorite parts of the building? He gets so excited about his projects." The innocent message was like a slap of cold water. Margaret stepped back from Daniel, putting safe distance between them. "I should go. The inspection looks good. You're doing excellent work." "Margaret, wait!" But she was already walking away, her heels clicking against the concrete floor with sharp finality. Behind her, she heard Daniel call her name once more, but she didn't turn around. She couldn't, because if she looked at him again, if she saw the same longing in his eyes that was tearing her apart inside, she might not be strong enough to walk away a second time. The drive home passed in a blur of traffic and regret. Margaret's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles went white, and she had to pull over twice to catch her breath. By the time she reached her house, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that reminded her painfully of the light that had been streaming through the windows during her almost confession to Daniel. Emma was waiting in the kitchen, flour dusting her clothes and a mixing bowl cradled in her arms. "Mom, perfect timing. I'm making Dad's chocolate chip cookies. Remember how he used to say they could solve any problem?" Margaret's throat tightened. Her husband had indeed believed that his grandmother's cookie recipe was a cure-all for everything, from scraped knees to broken hearts. Looking at Emma now, covered in flour and smiling with the same optimism that had gotten her father through medical school, Margaret felt the full weight of her betrayal. "How did the inspection go?" Emma asked, spooning dough onto a baking sheet. "Daniel texted that you seemed pleased with the progress." "It's coming along well," Margaret managed. "He's very talented." "I knew you'd see it eventually." Emma's smile was radiant. "He's been so worried about impressing you, about proving he's worthy of our family. I told him he already is, but you know how men are about approval from important women in their lives." Important women, plural? Margaret wondered if Emma had any idea how accurate that statement was becoming. "Speaking of approval," Emma continued, setting down the mixing bowl and turning to face her mother directly, "I need to know what your concerns are. Really, because Daniel is convinced you think he's not good enough, and I can't stand seeing him doubt himself like this." Margaret sank onto one of the kitchen bar stools, suddenly exhausted. "My concerns have nothing to do with Daniel's worth as a person." "Then what?" "You're young, Emma. You have your whole life ahead of you. Marriage is a big commitment, and I want to make sure you're not rushing into it because it feels romantic or exciting." Emma's expression grew serious. "Do you think I don't know my own mind? I think you're 18 and in love, and that combination has been known to cloud judgment. Like it clouded yours when you married Dad?" The question hit Margaret like a physical blow. She had been 22 when she married Emma's father, young and idealistic, and certain that love could conquer any obstacle. Their marriage had been happy, built on mutual respect and shared dreams. But it had also been safe, predictable, nothing like the dangerous, complicated feelings Daniel stirred in her. "Your father and I were different," Margaret said carefully. "We grew up together. We knew each other's families, shared the same background. And you think Daniel and I don't share anything important?" Emma's voice rose slightly. "Mom, he understands me in ways I didn't know were possible. He listens when I talk about my dreams. He supports my ideas even when they're crazy. He makes me feel like I can be myself without apologies." "Those are all good things," Margaret admitted, "but marriage requires more than understanding and support. It requires maturity, financial stability, the ability to weather storms together. Like the storm of having a mother who doesn't approve." The hurt in Emma's voice was unmistakable. Margaret reached across the counter, covering her daughter's flour-dusted hand with her own. "I want to approve, sweetheart. More than anything, I just need to be sure you're making this decision for the right reasons." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "The right reason is that I love him, that he loves me, that we want to build a life together. What other reasons should there be?" Margaret thought about all the practical considerations she'd learned to value. Over the years, financial security, social compatibility, shared ambitions, professional networks. All the things that made sense on paper, but meant nothing when your heart was breaking into pieces every time you looked at your daughter's fiancé. "Maybe there shouldn't be other reasons," Margaret said quietly. "Maybe I've forgotten what it feels like to make decisions with your heart instead of your head." Emma squeezed her hand. "Then remember, Mom, Remember what it felt like when Dad looked at you like you were the most amazing thing he'd ever seen. Because that's how Daniel looks at me. Margaret nodded, though her throat felt like it was closing, because she did remember how it felt to be looked at like that. She just wished she could forget how it felt when Daniel looked at her the same way. 3 weeks later, Margaret found herself standing in the bridal shop, watching Emma try on her third dress of the day. The ivory silk clung to her daughter's young body like liquid moonlight, and the happiness radiating from Emma's face was almost painful to witness. In the mirror's reflection, Margaret caught sight of her own expression, hollow-eyed and brittle like a woman holding herself together with sheer willpower. "What do you think, Mom?" Emma spun around, the dress fanning out in a perfect circle. "Daniel hasn't seen it yet, obviously, but Mrs. Chen says it's the most popular style this season." Margaret forced a smile. "You look beautiful, sweetheart, you always do." But Emma's face fell slightly. "You don't like it?" "I didn't say that." "You don't have to say it, I can see it in your eyes." Emma turned back to the mirror, studying her reflection with newfound uncertainty. "You think it's too much, don't you? Too expensive, too flashy." "Emma, stop." Margaret moved closer, placing her hands on her daughter's shoulders. In the mirror, they looked like two different generations of the same woman. Emma young and glowing with possibility, Margaret weathered by years of compromise and control. "The dress is perfect. You're perfect. I'm just what? Dying. Inside, falling apart, in love with your fiancé. Just emotional about my little girl getting married." Emma's expression softened. "Oh, Mom, I know this is hard for you. After Dad died, it was just us for so long. But Daniel isn't taking me away from you. He's adding to our family." Margaret nodded, though the words felt like knives twisting in her chest. Daniel wasn't taking Emma away. He was making Margaret realize how empty her life had become, how desperately she craved the kind of connection she saw between him and her daughter. The bridal shop consultant, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and practiced hands, began pinning the dress for alterations. "Your daughter has excellent taste," she told Margaret, "and such a lovely figure. This dress will photograph beautifully." "The wedding is in 2 months," Emma said, her voice bubbling with excitement, "at the Whitmore estate. Daniel and I want something elegant, but not too formal. We're hoping for that perfect balance of traditional and personal." "That sounds lovely, dear. And your fiancé, is he involved in the planning?" Emma's face lit up the way it always did when someone asked about Daniel. "Oh yes, he has opinions about everything. He designed our invitation himself. It has little architectural drawings around the border, and he's insisting on sustainable flowers and locally sourced food. He cares about things like that." Margaret listened to Emma gush about Daniel's thoughtfulness, his creativity, his environmental consciousness, and felt each word like a physical blow. Every quality that made him perfect for Emma also made him perfect for Margaret. Every reason her daughter loved him was a reason Margaret had fallen for him too. "Mom, are you okay?" Emma's voice cut through her thoughts. "You look pale." "I'm fine, just tired." Margaret checked her watch, desperate for an escape. "I should get going. I have a conference call in an hour." On Saturday. Business doesn't observe weekends. You know that. Emma's reflection in the mirror looked disappointed. "I was hoping we could get lunch after this, maybe talk more about the wedding details. I feel like we haven't really connected since Daniel proposed." The irony was devastating. Emma thought they were drifting apart because of work, when the truth was that Margaret couldn't bear to be around her daughter's happiness for extended periods. Every conversation about the wedding was a reminder of what Margaret couldn't have, shouldn't want, and definitely couldn't pursue. "Tomorrow," Margaret promised, hating herself for the lie. "We'll spend the whole day together tomorrow." But Sunday came and went, with Margaret inventing excuse after excuse to avoid Emma's calls. By Monday morning, she was buried so deep in work that her assistant had to remind her to eat lunch. By Tuesday, she'd taken on 3 new projects that would require extensive travel. By Wednesday, Emma stopped calling altogether. Margaret told herself this was better. Distance would cure whatever madness had possessed her. Time away from both, Emma and Daniel would restore her perspective and help her remember her role as a mother, not a woman. But Wednesday evening, her plans for emotional distance imploded when Daniel showed up at her office unannounced. "We need to talk," he said, standing in her doorway like an avenging angel. His usually calm demeanor was cracked around the edges, and Margaret could see the strain in the tight lines around his eyes. "I'm working. Emma is falling apart." Daniel closed the door behind him and moved toward her desk. "She thinks she's done something wrong, that you disapprove of her choices, that you're pulling away because you don't want her to get married." Margaret's hands stilled on her keyboard. "That's not true, isn't it?" Daniel sat down across from her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're doing everything possible to avoid your own daughter." "I've been busy." "Bullshit." The profanity was so unexpected from Daniel that Margaret actually flinched. "I know busy, Margaret. I work 80-hour weeks trying to get my firm off the ground. But I still make time for the people I love." The people he loved. The phrase hung between them, loaded with meaning neither of them dared to examine too closely. "Emma is the most important person in my life," Margaret said carefully. "Everything I do is for her." "Then why is she crying herself to sleep every night, wondering what she did to make her mother hate her?" The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She pushed back from her desk, standing abruptly. "I don't hate Emma. I could never hate Emma." "Then what's going on?" Daniel stood too, and suddenly the spacious office felt cramped with the tension radiating between them. "Because 3 weeks ago you were supportive and involved, and now you won't even return her phone calls." Margaret walked to the window, staring out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the early evening dusk. She could see Daniel's reflection in the glass, watching her with an intensity that made her skin burn. "Maybe I'm having second thoughts about the marriage," she said, testing the words to see how they felt on her tongue. "Because of me." It wasn't a question. Margaret's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn around. "You're very perceptive." "It's not about my financial situation." "No. It's not about my age or my background or my career prospects." "No, Sebastian." "Then what is it about, Margaret?" Her name on his lips was like a caress and a curse. Margaret closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. "You know what it's about." The silence stretched between them, heavy with admission and regret. Margaret could hear Daniel's breathing, could sense him moving closer even though she couldn't see him. When he spoke again, his voice was right behind her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath on her. "Tegaka, this is killing me too," he whispered. Margaret's eyes flew open. In the window's reflection, she could see Daniel standing directly behind her, his face etched with the same anguish she felt. "Don't." "Don't what?" "Don't tell the truth. Don't admit that I think about you when I should be thinking about Emma. Don't confess that I lie awake at night wondering what would have happened if we'd met each other first. Stop." Margaret spun around, putting her back against the window. Daniel was standing closer than she'd realized, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes, close enough to smell his cologne mixed with the lingering scent of sawdust from his workday. "I can't stop," Daniel said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've tried, God knows I've tried. But every time I'm with Emma, I'm thinking about you. Every time she talks about how happy she is, I feel like I'm lying to her." "Because you are lying to her. We both are." "Then what do we do?" Daniel's hand moved as if to touch her face, then dropped to his side. "Because I can't marry your daughter feeling like this." The words hung in the air between them like a bomb waiting to explode. Margaret stared at Daniel, seeing her own torment reflected in his eyes. This was the moment when they either stepped back from the edge or jumped off together. "Consequences be damned. You have to marry her," Margaret whispered. "She loves you." "I love her too, but not the way I—" Daniel stopped, shaking his head. "This is insane. You're her mother. I know what I am. Do you?" Daniel stepped closer, close enough that Margaret could feel the heat radiating from his body. "Because right now, you don't feel like Emma's mother. Right now, You feel like a woman I'm falling in love with." The confession shattered something inside Margaret's chest. She'd known, of course, had felt it building between them for weeks. But hearing the words spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified and thrilled her. "We can't," she said, but the words had no strength behind them. "I know. Emma would never forgive us. I know. It would destroy everything. I know. That too." But despite knowing all of this, despite the impossibility of the situation, Daniel reached up and cupped Margaret's face in his calloused hands. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, and Margaret felt herself melting under his touch. "Margaret," he breathed, and she could see him wavering on the edge of a decision that would change all their lives forever. Before either of them could cross that final line, the office door burst open. Emma stood in the doorway, her face bright with surprise and excitement. "Mom, I thought I'd surprise you and Daniel with dinner. Mrs. Chen called to say the dress alterations are ready. Early, and I wanted to—" She stopped mid-sentence, taking in the scene before her. Daniel's hands on her mother's face, the intimate distance between them, the guilty shock on both their faces as they sprang apart like teenagers caught by their parents. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's expression shifted from surprise to confusion to dawning understanding, each emotion crossing her face like clouds across the sun. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken. "How long?" "Emma, sweetheart," Margaret started, but Emma held up a hand to stop her. "How long have you been in love with my fiancé?" The question was like a slap. Margaret felt her knees go weak, and she had to grip the windowsill to keep from falling. "It's not what you think." "Isn't it?" Emma's voice was getting stronger, fueled by anger and hurt. "Because it looks like my mother and my fiancé are having some kind of affair." "We're not having an affair," Daniel said quietly. "Nothing has happened between us. Yet." Emma's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Nothing has happened yet. Is that supposed to make me feel better?" Margaret forced herself to move away from the window to face her daughter directly. "Emma, I never meant for this to happen. I tried to fight it, tried to stay away. Is that why you've been avoiding me? Because you're in love with Daniel?" The words hung in the air like an accusation and a death sentence combined. Margaret looked at her daughter's face, seeing the pain and betrayal written in every line, and felt something die inside her chest. "Yes," she whispered. Emma's face crumpled. She looked from Margaret to Daniel and back again, her eyes filling with tears that made Margaret's heart shatter into 1,000 pieces. My own mother is trying to steal my fiancé." "That's not what's happening," Daniel said desperately. "Emma, I love you. I want to marry you." "Do you?" Emma's voice was cold now, protective ice forming over the hurt. "Because you certainly didn't look like a man in love with me when I walked in here." Daniel ran his hands through his hair, his face etched with anguish. "It's complicated." "No, it's not." Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and when she looked up again, her expression was harder than Margaret had ever seen it. "It's actually very simple. You're either in love with me or you're in love with my mother. You can't be in love with both of us. Emma, choose." The word was like a gunshot in the quiet office. "Right now, choose." Margaret watched Daniel's face, seeing him struggle with a decision that had no right answer. If he chose Emma, he would be lying to her, building their marriage on a foundation of deception. If he chose Margaret, he would destroy Emma's heart and probably Margaret's relationship with her daughter forever. "I can't," Daniel said finally. "I can't choose between you." Emma nodded, her face eerily calm. "Then you've chosen neither of us?" She pulled the engagement ring off her finger and set it on Margaret's desk with a soft click that sounded like a door closing forever. "I hope you're both happy together. I hope whatever this is was worth destroying our family." "Emma, wait!" Margaret started forward, but Emma was already backing toward the door. "Don't." Emma's voice was steady, but Margaret could see the tears streaming down her face. "Just don't. I can't look at either of you right now." And then she was gone, leaving Margaret and Daniel alone with the wreckage of everything they'd destroyed. The silence that followed Emma's exit was suffocating, Margaret stared at the engagement ring sitting on her desk, its diamond facets catching the office lights like fractured tears. Daniel stood frozen by the window, his face grey with shock and regret. "We have to fix this," Margaret said finally. "How?" Daniel's voice was hollow. "How do we fix the fact that we've fallen in love with each other when we had no right to?" Margaret walked to her desk, picked up the engagement ring, and held it out to Daniel. "You go after her. You tell her it was all my fault, that I misread the situation, that I threw myself at you and you were just being polite. I won't lie to her anymore. Then you'll lose her forever." Daniel stared at the ring in Margaret's palm. "I think I already have." 6 months later, Margaret stood at her office window watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and pink. Emma had moved to California, taking a job with an environmental non-profit and refusing all of Margaret's attempts at reconciliation. Daniel had left town 2 weeks after the confrontation, selling his half-finished projects and disappearing without leaving a forwarding address. Margaret's empire was still intact. Her bank account was still growing. Her reputation in the business world remained untarnished, but her heart felt like an empty house echoing with the ghosts of what might have been. The phone on her desk rang, interrupting her melancholy. Her assistant's voice came through the speaker. "Mrs. Sullivan, your daughter is on line 1. Margaret's heart stopped. She hadn't heard Emma's voice in 6 months, hadn't known if she would ever hear it again. With shaking hands, she picked up the receiver. "Emma? Hi, Mom." Emma's voice was different, older, sadder, but no. Longer, filled with the rage that had been there during their last conversation. "I think it's time we talked." Margaret closed her eyes, tears of relief streaming down her face. "I'd like that very much. I'll be in town next week for work. Can we have lunch?" "Yes, anywhere you want, anytime you want." There was a pause, and when Emma spoke again, her voice was softer. "I'm still angry, Mom, and I'm still hurt, but I miss you, and I think I'm finally ready to understand what happened." Margaret gripped the phone tighter, hope blooming in her chest for the first time in months. "I miss you too, sweetheart, more than you can possibly know." After Emma hung up, Margaret continued to stand at the window, watching the city wake up around her. She thought about love and loss, about choices and consequences, about the price of wanting something you couldn't have. She thought about Daniel, wherever he was now, and wondered if he ever thought about her too. The truth was that some love stories didn't have happy endings. Some love stories were about learning to live with the weight of impossible choices and finding a way to forgive yourself for being human. Margaret had learned to love differently now, to love her daughter from a distance, to love the memory of what she and Daniel might have been, and slowly, carefully, to love herself enough to believe she might deserve a second chance at happiness someday. The heart she had discovered was infinitely capable of breaking and healing and breaking again, and maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what it meant to be alive.